28 Days Later is often regarded as somewhat of a new wave zombie film, a picture where the infected seem to have better control of their limbs. It's fair then to theorise that this is how fear is created. It stems from the grotesque and violent imagery. But is that really why 28 Days Later succeeds as a terrifying depiction of desolation amidst a worldwide pandemic? I think to truly understand how fear is successfully created and crafted by Danny Boyle, one needs to look no further than the use of intimacy. And I mean that both in its literal sense, as well as the way in which Boyle frames characters to concoct said intimacy. Right from the first image we get of Jim, played wonderfully by Cillian Murphy, Danny Boyle is already attempting to establish an intimacy between the audience and the titular character. The hospital was initially supposed to be overwrought with piles of dead bodies, but by stripping it of its volume and leaving it empty, emphasis is instead placed on how alone Jim is in this world, a world which seems to have moved on in his absence. In 28 Days Later, atmosphere and surrealism trump plot requirements and are often the reason why this film breaks out of the typical Hollywood zombie fare. The minute Jim steps out of the hospital, we are met with the iconic image of him meandering through the empty streets of London, an image which almost echoes the emptiness of his mind, one which lacks knowledge as to what happened. Instead of the extreme close-ups we were introduced to in the hospital scenes, Boyle instead opts for these wide and craning shots to place emphasis on how small Jim is in comparison to the world around him. And if the camera is closer up, it's typically from the ground, giving the effect of these tipped cars towering over him. His solitude and loneliness in this stroll establishes an intimacy between he and the audience, since he suffers alone and we are powerless to help. The idea of a heavily populated London being empty forces the audience to share Jim's confusion and restlessness. That intimacy and compassion is what breeds fear in the initial moments of the film, since Jim could be attacked at any moment during this period of vulnerability. The amateur, almost mockumentary aesthetic of the film creates a real haunting feeling. The direction makes the story feel tangible and believable. I mean, after all, it's easier to manipulate the audience into feeling an intimate connection with the characters if their struggles appear genuine. From a script standpoint, it's also fairly important that Jim never has superior knowledge to the audience. As he is fed information, so are we. We share every single reaction of his to new information, in particular the scene following Selina and Mark saving him from being killed by the infected. In this particular scene, the camera bounces between Selina and Mark as they, much like the aforementioned cars and buildings, tower over Jim. The constant shifting of the camera helps transmit Jim's confusion, claustrophobia and nervousness to the audience as he learns of the death of humanity. Boyle almost establishes a sense of villainy to the characters of Selina and Mark, only to humanize them moments later. What's important is that Boyle manipulates every character interaction with unique camera angles and swift movement to aid that feeling of intimacy. We often feel as though we shouldn't be watching, as if the camera is attempting to swat us away from the screen. The first real location that these three travel to is Jim's home. The father and mother tangled together emphasizes closeness of the family without exposition. Furthermore, the note on the picture makes it more intimate, so much so that when Jim breaks down, the camera almost pulls away, another nod toward the fact that this almost feels too real for the audience to be witnessing. It's not so much that the intimacy is earned, rather that it's forced upon the audience. It's almost our punishment for tuning into such a brutal and unrelenting story. We must carry the character's pain and emotions, for he is as lost as we are, or at least would be in that situation. But just before we begin to develop a strong emotional connection to Jim and Jim alone, Boyle offers us this incredibly directed scene where every iota of dialogue is delivered with the characters' faces crushed right against the screen. When static conversations tend to happen in film, we're often given these mundane tracking shots of the room or panning between characters. Instead, Boyle offers us these hyper-zoomed shots. They feel amateur and uncontrolled, but there's an underlying mastery to them. It gives the effect of being inside their minds to some capacity. It's a true initial gateway to intimacy between the characters we've just met. This is crucial too, since Mark's death a few moments later would not be as affecting if not for those super intimate shots. We then get this shot, perhaps my most favourite and most beautiful of the entire film. As we're forced to look at a desolate and empty London, a small reflection is inserted into the top left hand corner of the shot. It's an image of Mark sound asleep, literally seconds away from death despite not knowing it. Boyle is quite cheeky and cunning here because he realises that the best way to force the audience to connect with a character is by embedding them into our consciousness. We should be focusing on these shots of London, but instead our mind is on the human. The untroubled silence encourages the audience again to connect with this man. Boyle is essentially juxtaposing the lack of life in London with the life right here in this room. He's showing the audience how valuable this new rarity is, almost like humanity is an extinct species. Once he gets you to care and reel you in, this happens. It sets this precedent for the film whereby you become emotionally connected to the characters because you value how precious life is. Mark almost stands as a warning to humanity to embrace one another before it's too late, and that's certainly something that Selina and Jim adhere to. Through these intimate shots and almost in an underhand way, Boyle puppeteers audience emotions throughout the entirety of the runtime. After Mark's death, Selina says to Jim,
"Did any of the blood get in your mouth?"
It's one of quite a few sexual allusions in this film that establishes a different type of intimacy, one of relationships. The mouth is the most intimate part of the face, yet this is also the place that Selina will end up kissing throughout the second and third acts of the film. It works as not only a way of showing the power of the infection, that just spatter can turn you into an infected, but it's also intimate. In this moment, Selina's recklessness makes the audience worry for her. She speaks of the blood-causing infection, yet she unmercifully hacks away at the body, caring not for any blood spatter. But by forcing the audience to care for her and fear some form of self-destruction, intimacy is built. When Jim and Selina wander upon an illuminated house in an otherwise dark building, the idea of family begins to brew in a world where families seem to no longer exist. We meet Frank and Hannah, two characters who will later forge a loving, familial bond with Jim and Selina. In fact, Frank will be the father figure that Jim has longed for.
You're having a bad dream, that's all. Thanks, Dad.
The way in which Boyle quickly establishes a strong emotional connection and intimacy to these two new characters is impressive and again quite cunning. Jim begins to shave his beard only to notice a lack of water. The following scene, we see a fish swimming in a tank. Despite no source of water to help themselves, we learn of the selflessness of humanity amidst chaos, particularly these two new characters. Keeping something as insignificant as a fish alive harkens back to the idea of cherishing life. Once this intimacy is established between the characters, both as individuals and a band of family, Boyle is allowed to earn every single emotional moment of the film and turn the audience inside out. Frank's death later on is earned. Despite being a horror zombie film, you really do get a chance to grieve for the characters. They never feel like collateral damage. Once his death occurs, we get personal, figurative flashes of him as a doting father and his aforementioned selflessness. Not only do we lose a human being, but we also lose that true essence of humanity, that pure goodness. Frank is, of course, put out of his misery by the army. One of those men is Major Henry West. It's through him where Boyle explores and juxtaposes genuine intimacy and one that's forced. This desolate world cries out for intimacy, but the reason it works with Jim and Selina, why it connects with the audience, is because it feels authentic. Their journey together is moving and uplifting, whereas the army sees Selina and Hannah as elements of procreation and sexual desire. They want to reproduce in a barren world to almost save humanity. By exploring this duality, Boyle seems to infer that sometimes the worst of humanity can erupt during moments of desperation. Genuine intimacy, the one between Selina, Jim and Hannah, acts as that one natural resource, a flickering flame dying out in a world quick to reject it. And that takes us up to the happy ending. And yes, there are two endings to the film, but this is the one they kept in the final cut. And really, it works better with the themes of intimacy and compassion, and the importance of both in a dying world. The film opened with a close-up of Jim lying in a bed, confused and searching for answers. It then ends with the camera bouncing between Selina and Hannah, and eventually closing on Jim smiling. It completes a cycle, one where Jim constantly looked for a father, only to find one within himself. His loneliness and solitude is completed by the presence of Hannah and Selina. The moral of the story? True intimacy gave the characters a purpose and willingness to survive. They earned their rescue and thus reinforced those intimate moments shared with the audience.
The biggest thing that we tried to do is to make an audience feel emotionally involved with the characters, because actually in this kind of a genre, you never feel that.
I wonder where the time went. I wonder why my mind's bent. I wonder why my retina's connected to the nebula, but only get the message from the fine print.